The palace corridors of Rome had been quiet in the hour before dawn, when even marble seemed to hold its breath. Torches sputtered against painted walls, throwing restless shadows over doorways meant to divide public power from private life. Footsteps measured discipline moved through passageways reserved for an emperor, the places where access itself functioned as permission. A man walked with the easy certainty of someone rarely refused, as if the architecture of empire could guarantee the stability of the person at its center. Ahead, members of the Praetorian Guard waited at the narrowed points of the Palatine complex, where voices carried strangely, and every whisper sounded like an omen. In a system built on proximity, who could enter, who could speak, who could be heard, those few steps of corridor mattered as much as any law. When Rome soon learned what had taken place inside the imperial precincts, the question spread faster than the official account itself. What kind of ruler could drive his own protectors to become his judges? The answer had begun long before the Palatine became a place of reckoning. It had begun in a world where power wore the mask of tradition, where republican language concealed imperial command, and where coercion remained the most reliable currency of the state. Rome, in the early 1st century, still called itself a republic in the way old families repeated inherited titles, yet it functioned as an empire, an old machine refitted to serve a single household. The Senate still gathered beneath dignified ceilings and spoke of ancestral customs, the liberties of citizens, and the authority of law. Magistracies were still filled, elections still occurred, decrees still carried familiar forms, but decisive authority over careers, property, status, and punishment had migrated elsewhere, into the hands of the princeps. The first citizen, a title chosen precisely because it sounded modest. Augustus crafted that arrangement with care. He understood that Romans feared kings even while they obeyed them, and he made monarchy appear like consensus. Armies remained under imperial command. Treasure and patronage moved through imperial favor. Governorships and priesthoods could be granted or withheld. The outward forms of republican debates survived, but opposition acquired a sharper meaning. To resist the emperor was not merely to argue policy. It was to risk being labeled an enemy of the state, a category that could be stretched until it included anyone convenient to eliminate. By the time Augustus died and Tiberius succeeded him, the harsh mechanics behind the curtain had grown harder to ignore. Treason trials multiplied. Informers prospered. Senators learned to applaud with exact timing, to praise without seeming false, to survive by becoming invisible. Under Tiberius, the state felt colder, not because its statutes had dramatically changed, but because its ruling class had been trained to suspect that a word, a facial expression, even silence might be read as evidence. Tiberius then withdrew from Rome to Capri, ruling increasingly at a distance through letters and intermediaries. The absence did not soften imperial control. It made it more unpredictable. In the vacuum around the emperor, courtiers and officials competed to interpret his will, and anxiety encouraged them to overreact. The Senate, deprived of any stable relationship with the ruler, performed obedience to messages arriving from an island, like commands from a remote and irritable power. Inside the imperial family, politics did not unfold only in formal sessions. It moved through bedrooms and nurseries, through marriages and adoptions, through the dangerous question of who might inherit. Bloodlines mattered, but suspicion mattered more. A grandson of Augustus could be exalted one year and ruined the next. In such a household, inheritance was both promise and threat. Into this world where power was intimate, and intimacy could become hazardous, was born a child who would later become a symbol of imperial excess. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. He was born in 12 CE amid the camp world of the Roman frontiers, where discipline was enforced by strict punishment, and loyalty was measured in pay and hardship. His father was Germanicus, the empire's golden prince, charismatic, victorious, beloved by soldiers and adored by crowds. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a granddaughter of Augustus, fierce in pride and unyielding in her claim to dynastic honor. The boy grew between two realities, the clang and order of military life, and the poisoned elegance of court politics where affection could be weaponized. As a small child, he was dressed in miniature soldier's boots and a tiny uniform, paraded among legionaries as mascot and charm. The soldiers gave him a nickname, Caligula, Little Boot, and the name adhered to him more tightly than formal titles ever would. Later it sounded like mockery to some and like prophecy to others, because it carried the memory of a time when he had been loved without calculation. That warmth did not protect him from the darkness at the center of imperial power. Germanicus, widely regarded as a potential heir, died suddenly in Syria in 19 CE. Rumors moved through Rome like smoke, whispers of poison, of jealousy within the palace, of orders sent from above. Whether Germanicus died by deliberate action or misfortune remained debated even in antiquity, but the political effect did not depend on certainty. His passing removed a beloved figure and left behind a widow whose grief could be interpreted as accusation. Agrippa became dangerous because she embodied a claim that could not be silenced without further outrage. Under Tiberius, and in the broader atmosphere of suspicion, the imperial household turned into a place where mourning could be read as ambition. In the years that followed, Caligula watched his family dismantled. His mother was sent into exile. Two of his brothers, Nero and Drusus, were ruined through imprisonment and deprivation, until they were no longer threats in any form. The child who had once been carried through camp streets as a talisman learned that imperial blood did not protect. It marked. Survival demanded silence. Silence demanded skill, the ability to hide thought and feeling behind a mask so smooth that even hatred could pass as gratitude. As Caligula grew older, he was drawn into the orbit of Tiberius on Capri, where the emperor lived apart while the Senate trembled at letters delivered from the sea. Ancient sources described Capri as a place of moral collapse and private cruelty, but the most sensational details were disputed and likely reflected hostile rumor as much as reality. What remained clear was that Caligula lived under the gaze of a suspicious old ruler and among courtiers who understood that a misplaced word could end a career or worse. In that environment, charm became armor. Patience became a method of self-preservation. Later, Reuters said he became a perfect actor, unreadable to those around him. If that was true, it was less talent than necessity. In 31 CE, the fall of Sejanus, Tiberius' powerful prefect, reminded Rome again that proximity to power could become a trap. Sejanus' ambition, and the paranoia it provoked, ended in a capital sentence, and his downfall reshuffled the court's fragile alliances. Many were swept away in the aftermath. Caligula remained standing. As other heirs were eliminated or died, his position grew more likely, not because the system rewarded merit, but because it consumed alternatives. By the late 30s, the empire's future had narrowed to a few names. One belonged to the quiet survivor from Capri, another belonged to Tiberius Gemellus, the emperor's grandson, still young. The uncertainty sharpened the tension around succession, because Rome had learned that the moment between one reign and the next was the moment when crises most easily emerged. In March of 37 CE, Tiberius died. Ancient accounts disagreed over whether illness alone ended him, or whether his end was hastened by those who wanted the old emperor gone. The truth remained uncertain. What followed was not uncertain. Rome erupted into celebration, as Caligula, Germanicus' son, was hailed as Princeps. The city that had endured years of dread greeted the new ruler as a kind of sunrise. He understood the theater of power and the hunger for relief. He began with gestures of mercy and renewal. He recalled exiles and made the rehabilitation of his family's memory a public act, turning private grief into political statement. The Senate, relieved and eager to believe, poured honors upon him. The people adored him. The legions remembered Germanicus and embraced the son. And for a moment it seemed as if popularity might accomplish what intimidation never could: stability without constant coercion. In those early months the regime looked as though it might cleanse itself of Tiberian dread. Caligula staged lavish games and distributed gifts. He moved through Rome as a young princeps who appeared to have no need to threaten obedience into existence. The brightness was real, but Rome's hunger for hope made it easy to mistake brightness for strength, and to forget how quickly the imperial system could turn. Within the first year, Caligula fell gravely ill. The details were unclear, and later narratives treated the illness as a hinge in the story, as though fever had cracked something that could not be repaired. Whether the change that followed was physiological, psychological, or simply political, whether a new emperor, having secured power, chose to rule differently, remained debated. Yet ancient accounts converged on the impression that after the sickness, the tone of the reign altered. As if gratitude had thinned into contempt, the ruler who had smiled upon senators began to look at them as instruments. The princeps who had offered mercy began to test how far intimidation could be pushed. Caligula had ascended as the beloved heir of Germanicus, but now he stood as master of Rome, impatient with restraint and increasingly willing to treat the old republican language as a costume others were forced to wear. The shift revealed itself in episodes that resembled scenes from tragedy, because they blended genuine emotion with public command. His devotion to his sister Drusilla became one of the most striking. She was close to him, perhaps the closest of his siblings, and, when she died in 38 CE, grief became spectacle. He ordered public mourning, and according to ancient sources, elevated her to divine honors. The act blurred family, state, and religion, and it forced Rome's elite to participate in devotion they could not shape. Religion in Rome was not merely belief, it was a language of legitimacy. Augustus approached divinity cautiously, allowing worship of his genius and accepting deification after death, letting sacred status settle like dust, rather than erupt like fire. Caligula seemed to press for sacred status in life. Statues and temples, rituals and oaths, boundaries that once separated the human ruler from the divine became malleable. Ancient writers claimed he demanded worship, appeared in divine costumes, and spoke as though ordinary limits did not apply. Some of those accounts likely carried exaggerations of hostile memory, but the tension they reflected was real. Rome's elite had been prepared to flatter. They were unsettled when flattery began to resemble compulsory surrender. Meanwhile, the imperial court became a place of sudden reversals. Favorites rose and fell with alarming speed. Wealthy men were accused, condemned, and stripped of fortunes that replenished the treasury, and demonstrated that property could be reclassified as a gift of the emperor. Extravagance became a symbol, whether it was unprecedented or simply more visible. Games grew frequent and costly. Banquets became occasions not merely for display but for dominance. Where public humiliation served a political function as deliberately as food, Caligula also turned to building. Because stone could outlast rumor, he advanced work on aqueducts, including projects later completed under Claudius, and he invested in infrastructure that mattered because water was power in the ancient city baths. Fountains, public health, civic pride, daily life itself. To command water was to command Rome's ordinary rhythms. He expanded the imperial palaces on the Palatine, binding the center of political life more tightly to the emperor's private world and making the geography of authority increasingly literal. Power lived where he slept. Then there were the spectacles that ancient writers could not forget, told and retold because they seemed to reveal a mind unbound. The temporary bridge across the Bay of boats, lashed into a causeway, endured as an image of command over nature itself. Sources suggested Caligula rode across in armor, turning engineering into performance. Later writers framed it as defiance of a prophecy that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding across the Gulf. As though the bridge had been built to insult fate. The motive remained uncertain: superstition, vanity, calculated intimidation, but the message was unmistakable. The world existed to be reshaped for his moment of triumph, yet the reign could not be explained as mere spectacle. Caligula's choices also contained political logic. Even when severe, the Senate was not a harmless relic. It was a body of aristocrats with wealth, networks, and a memory of older power. They survived Augustus by cooperation and survived Tiberius by caution. Now they faced a young emperor shaped by family catastrophe, a man who had learned that suspicion could dismantle a household, and who may have decided that the best defense was to wield suspicion first. In such an atmosphere, achievement and excess became difficult to separate because both served as instruments of rule. Bread and games soothed the populace and displayed generosity. Construction projects left tangible benefits while advertising capacity. Religious innovation bound loyalty to the emperor's person. Coercive measures kept rivals cautious. The danger was that coercion, once used as proof of strength, rarely remained discipline. It invited la plaza, and it trained enemies to believe they had no safe alternative but direct action. Foreign policy added another layer of risk. The Rhine frontier still mattered, and Germanicus' memory haunted the legions as an ideal of military leadership. Caligula traveled north in 39 to 40 CE, and ancient sources described preparations for campaigns in Germania and movements that reached the Channel coast opposite Britain. One episode later, writers seized upon collectum seashells, as spoils of the sea, became famous precisely because it could be read in multiple ways, as lunacy, satire, misunderstanding, or hostile invention. What appeared more secure was that real troops moved, real expense was incurred, and Caligula's relationship with the army carried immense weight. An emperor could not afford to be merely adored in Rome. He had to be obeyed by armed men far from the city. This remained the central problem of the Principate. It demanded balance among Senate, people, and military. Augustus balanced it through patience and symbolism. Tiberius balanced it through grim caution and threat. Caligula, young, scarred, and intoxicated by sudden adoration, pushed the balance too hard and too fast. In doing so, he created enemies who no longer believed popularity would protect them, or him. Opposition formed in layers. Senators resented humiliation and feared confiscation. Aristocrats who had survived prior reigns recognized familiar patterns in accusations in sudden capital prosecutions. Courtiers learned again that proximity could become a trap. Even within Caligula's household, trust eroded as unpredictability became a kind of policy. Plots emerged. Some were real. Some may have been expanded afterward to justify reprisals. In 39 CE, a conspiracy reportedly involved Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, Caligula's brother-in-law, and the emperor's sisters Agrippina, the younger, and Julia Livilla. Lepidus was put to death. The sisters were exiled. The episode mattered not only for the human cost, but for what it revealed. The imperial family remained dangerous, and Caligula, once victim of dynastic paranoia, now wielded that paranoia as a tool of survival. Each purge did not restore trust. It proved that no bond marriage, blood friendship could guarantee security. Ancient sources also accused Caligula of sexual transgressions and deliberate degradation of others. Such charges required caution. Roman political writing often weaponized sexual scandal to portray a ruler as tyrannical and unnatural, and hostile traditions could turn rumor into certainty. Some accusations may have preserved genuine behavior. Others likely reflected moralizing imagination, yet even discounted for exaggeration. The broader picture remained consistent. The court was a place where boundaries were unstable, and where humiliation functioned as a demonstration of dominance. The Senate's relationship with Caligula deteriorated into forced reverence. Senators offered divine honors. Caligula accepted them with an air that suggested they were overdue. Humor became perilous. Silence could be interpreted as dissent. Rituals meant to bind ruler and elite instead exposed contempt on both sides, and every public display of unity carried the pressure of something that might break. Beyond Rome, Caligula's religious posture created dangerous friction in provinces where imperial images and honors touched older, closely guarded beliefs. Writers such as Philo of Alexandria and Josephus describe crises involving Jewish communities and the tension over imperial images and divine honors, including the highly charged issue of Jerusalem's temple. Their accounts reflected particular perspectives and agendas, but they indicated how quickly an emperor's insistence on sacred status could ignite unrest far from the capital, turning ideology into potential revolt. Even the rumor of a policy could destabilize a region, because it raised the question of whether obedience now required sacrilege. The Praetorian Guard, stationed close to the heart of power, watched all of this with pragmatic clarity. Their loyalty was not abstract. It rested on payment, prestige, and survival. They existed to protect the emperor, but they also depended on the state's stability to protect themselves. When an emperor appeared to endanger the system that fed and honored them, loyalty could become calculation. By the final years of Caligula's reign, Rome's atmosphere thickened with resentment and anticipation, as though the city itself waited for a rupture. The end came in January of 41 CE, amid the crowded energy of public festivities. Caligula attended games and performances, moving through palace and theater spaces with the confidence of someone accustomed to being untouchable. The conspirators were not foreign enemies or rebellious legionaries on a distant frontier. They were close enough to hear his voice, to see his habits, to know the rhythms of his movements. They operated inside the machinery meant to keep him safe. Cassius Ria, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, was named in ancient accounts as a central figure. Those accounts said he had been mocked and publicly slighted by the emperor, though personal grievance alone rarely explained the decision to remove a ruler. Others joined him, guardsmen and insiders, suggesting a conspiracy rooted not merely in wounded pride but in the belief that Caligula had become intolerable, a danger to those around him and to the state's brittle equilibrium. In a corridor of the imperial complex, the attack came quickly. The emperor was struck down by men assigned to his protection, and in that confined space, the illusion of invulnerability dissolved. Ceremony offered no protection. Only loyalty could have done that, and loyalty had already fractured. Ancient sources reported that the violence then widened to Caligula's wife, Caesania, and their young daughter, who were also put to death. In Roman power struggles, family members were often treated not as bystanders but as potential claimants and living symbols. The conspirators aimed not merely to remove a man, but to sever the possibility that his household could become a rallying point for those involved. The assassination was meant to open a new beginning, perhaps a restoration of senatorial authority, perhaps a different style of Principate, but the empire did not return to the old republic. Power, once concentrated, did not willingly disperse, and those who held weapons near the palace understood that truth better than those who held speeches in the Senate. In the confusion after the assassination, the Senate debated and hesitated. For a moment the old dream of republican freedom flickered in a room full of men whose ancestors had once commanded armies and whose present reality depended on imperial favor. Meanwhile, the Praetorian Guard acted by found Claudius Caligula, Uncle Awkward, underestimated, long kept on the margins, and proclaimed him emperor. Later stories claimed he was discovered hiding behind a curtain. Whether that detail was embellishment, the outcome was not. The Guard had chosen, and the Senate complied. Caligula's downfall exposed a hard truth about the imperial system. The emperor might claim to be first among citizens, but succession could hinge on soldiers inside the palace. The assassination was not merely the end of a reign. It demonstrated how fragile the Principate became when coercion replaced workable consent, and how quickly the instruments of protection could become instruments of judgment. In the years that followed, Caligula's name became a warning, and the story hardened. Ancient writers painted him in colors so dark they seemed almost unreal. A monster, a madman, a tyrant who wished Rome had a single neck for a single stroke. Tales multiplied of a horse-made consul, of incest, of cruelty performed for amusement. Some may have preserved distorted kernels of truth. Others likely belonged to hostile tradition, senatorial bitterness, and the human appetite for moral drama, intensified by the need to explain why violence inside the palace had been justified. The surviving sources presented a challenge. Suetonius, writing later, collected anecdotes vivid in detail, but not always carefully weighed. Cassius Dio, later still, shaped events into moral narrative. Philo and Josephus, writing from Jewish perspectives, emphasized the crisis created by imperial demands for honors and images, highlighting how religious policy could become political threat. Each voice carried its own audience, its own purposes, its own injuries. Modern historians therefore debated not only what Caligula did, but why the story of Caligula took the shape it did. Was he mentally ill, as ancient writers implied? Or was madness a label applied to a ruler who violated elite expectations? Did illness alter him, or did security reveal him? Were the most lurid stories accurate, exaggerated, or constructed to justify his removal and protect the reputations of those who benefited from it? The record allowed no easy verdict, yet even when sensationalism was stripped away, a harder core remained. Caligula ruled in ways that generated sustained fear among the elite. He treated the Senate with contempt and played with the boundaries between reverence and humiliation until the Pnyxic's distinction collapsed. He pushed imperial self-deification further into the open, alarming those who depended on the older language of republican restraint to make obedience tolerable. He created enemies within the guard meant to shield him, and he did so within a system already trained toward suspicion, where accusation, confiscation, and capital punishment were not aberrations but familiar tools. His legacy therefore rested not only on personality but on structure. Caligula became a symbol of tyranny because the Principate at its worst invited tyranny. It placed immense power into a single human will and relied on that will to restrain itself. When restraint failed, through character, trauma, calculation, or some combination, the consequences were immediate and final, and the state possessed no stable mechanism for correction except another seizure of power. In the centuries after his death, Caligula's image hardened into archetype, the emperor as nightmare. Yet even that archetype revealed something real about Rome's governing class. What they feared most was not simply vice, but unpredictability. Not merely severity, but the collapse of shared rules that allowed powerful men to coexist without constant dread. Under Caligula, the ground seemed to shift beneath every oath. The line between worship and survival blurred until they became nearly indistinguishable. So the corridor on the Palatine, marked by violence in the half-light of morning, became more than a scene of political rupture. It became a mirror held up to an empire that tried to disguise monarchy as tradition. Caligula had entered history in a child's boots, paraded before soldiers who adored him, and he had fallen as an emperor, brought down by guardians who concluded the system could no longer absorb his rule. Between those two images lay the story of Rome's early empire, a state brilliant in administration and architecture, yet haunted by succession and dependent on temperament. Some remembered Caligula as a deranged tyrant, others saw a young ruler, shaped by losses so severe that power became his only armor. The truth, filtered through hostile pens and fractured memories, remained contested. The lesson of his reign did not, when authority became absolute, it invited absolute fear, and fear, sooner or later, produced the kind of decisions that ended reigns in corridors. Rome endured. Aqueducts still carried water, the Senate still convened, legions still marched, yet the stones of the Palatine kept the memory of disciplined footsteps before dawn, and of the sudden silence that followed an echo of the empire's bargain, and of the price it demanded when that bargain collapsed.